environmental defenders face many risks while protecting Jamaica's natural resources. They often lack adequate access to information, justice, and meaningful participation in decision making. That's where the Escazú Agreement comes in. It's a game changer and a landmark regional treaty ensuring access to adequate environmental information, justice, participation in decision making, and stronger protections for environmental defenders. Hello, my global family. I'm Danielle, and welcome to this special series called Defending Our Rights, Environmental Justice in Jamaica, brought to you by the Jamaica Environment Trust in collaboration with Global Yaadie and with support from the UNDP implemented Global Environment Facilities Small Grants Program. Now in this series, we'll be exploring the Escazú Agreement and what it means in securing environmental rights within the context of Jamaica. Now, in this episode, we're joined by Jamaican environment lawyer Danielle Andrade-Goffe, and we will be breaking down the Escazú Agreement and why it matters for Jamaica. Because in this series, while we will be having conversations around Escazú, how is it related to media, youth, community participation, the work of other non-governmental organizations, and so forth, we really need to understand what this agreement is about, and that's why we have Danielle today. Danielle, welcome to the Global Yaadie podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. So first things first, Escazú. I know the minute people hear that, they're asking, what is this and what is it about? So can you explain what the Escazú Agreement is and why it was created?
Sure. So the Escazú Agreement is a regional agreement, a treaty between Latin American and Caribbean countries. Currently, there are 17 countries that have ratified the agreement. They are parties to the agreement. 8 of those countries are Caribbean countries. And it is a treaty that seeks as its objective to ensure the implementation of the rights of access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decisions, and access to justice in environmental matters. So it's really about empowering people to be able to exercise these types of rights related to the environment.
Thank you for that. I know we're going to get into it because the minute you say 8 countries, I know people are going to wonder, is Jamaica on that list? And I don't want to preempt. But still, we're exploring what this agreement means, especially in the context, in the Jamaican context. So what would you say is the relationship between Escazú and the right to a healthy environment in Jamaica?
All right. So first of all, Article 4 of the Escazú Agreement actually includes an obligation on governments, on countries, to ensure that every person has a right to live in a healthy environment. So states have a duty to ensure that. In addition to that, the rights of access to information, public participation, and access to justice, they are rights that help people to be able to protect their own environment. So, for example, if people have access to environmental information, we're talking about people being able to know what is the quality of the air that you're breathing, the water that you're drinking. If people can participate in decisions, if there is a project, an activity that has been approved that directly impacts you and in some way might affect your environment adversely, then how can you participate meaningfully in that decision in order to influence the outcome? And then access to justice. If there is a violation in relation to something that adversely impacts your environment, do you have the means to challenge it, to enforce it, to protect the environment? So the Escazú Agreement seeks to provide these rights, which are tools that people can use to protect their environment, to ensure that they can live in a healthy environment.
All right. And so by this explanation, it begs the question, how does it differ? How does Escazú differ from other environmental agreements? Because we want to know what was in place before and, what does it now mean for Jamaica and the wider Caribbean?
The Escazú Agreement is the first environmental treaty between Latin America and the Caribbean, which seeks to ensure that people can exercise these types of rights, information, participation, and justice, as well as include specific provisions to protect environmental defenders. Now, environmental defenders are people who in the course of their work, where they seek to protect their environment, they may be victimized, harassed, persecuted. And so the agreement ensures that states put in place measures to prevent as well as punish those types of threats and attacks against defenders.
All right. So some people who are familiar with the Escazú tend to think, and we do know that in Latin America sometimes there are extreme cases. But what do you say to persons who question if those things are applicable to the Jamaican context and the Caribbean context, where we may not have extreme cases of murder, victimization, and so on?
Right. So, Caribbean, we have our own specific complexities and nuances, and definitely as it relates to the work that environmental defenders do. And when I say environmental defenders, I'm speaking not just about people who, let's say, work with environmental NGOs. It could be the average person on the street who, let us say, a development is being proposed in their neighborhood and it affects them adversely. They want to speak about it. They want to attend a public meeting to discuss it. They want to write to their representative government and say, what is going on? I have a concern about this. Anybody who voices their opinion in some way, in a way in which they're trying to protect their environment, can be viewed as an environmental defender. And us being in the Caribbean, those persons may not experience kidnappings and murders, but there are other things that may affect them adversely and affect the way in which they choose to be able to exercise their rights to participate in decisions. For example, people may be harassed, people may receive threats, people may lose work and opportunities. It might affect them economically. People may also, for example, I know of cases where persons have received threats or actually been sued for defamation for speaking out about projects which they did not agree with, and speaking out as part of a public participation process as well. So these are just some of the ways in which people in the Caribbean have, in a way, people have sought to silence environmental defenders in the Caribbean. And these are all things, acts of intimidation, which the agreement, Escazú Agreement, recognizes and requires countries to put in measures to protect environmental defenders.
Thank you for that insight, and I made sure to ask the question that way because I really wanted you to speak to that, because while we're not necessarily comparing extremes and thinking that, if it's not at this level of the spectrum, it's, something that we shouldn't take into consideration, but it is an obstruction to pursuing environmental justice. And I've known of cases and persons have shared, within the context of pursuing environmental justice, where intimidation can inhibit a process and an outcome. And so a lot of people may have more or less to lose. And when you threaten people, especially when you mention about losing their work and so on, that reduces the potency of the voices that are speaking out and trying to bring attention to critical issues. So really happy that you were able to underscore that for the benefit of our audience. And so when we think about the provisions of the Escazú Agreement and what it means to achieve, we have to be realistic as well, because we're pushing for governments to ratify and all of that. What would be the biggest challenges to implementing the agreement for Jamaica? And you can maybe take that in two phases, like from the part of the environmental defenders, what would be the challenge here, or from a government standpoint, what would be the challenge?
So I think when we think of environmental defenders, I think you hit the nail on the head that people don't necessarily think of this as being an issue for us, because I think there's a lack of understanding about, first of all, who environmental defenders are and some of the types of threats and acts of intimidation that they can be impacted by, because I don't think we have an understanding of the issue, and I don't think we document it as well. So I think one of the challenges we have is being able to understand the extent and the scope of how environmental defenders are impacted in Jamaica and in the region, in the Caribbean. And so if we can understand, do the work to understand that,
Yes.
then we'll be able to put in place the proper measures to respond to it. So some sort of situational analysis, I think, needs to be done in that respect for Jamaica. In relation to the government now, I think one of the challenges that Jamaica has, I think it's two challenges actually. I think one of them has to do with capacity. So, you know, Caribbean, as a Caribbean country, we have limited capacity. Some of our Latin American countries who are part of this process may have, you know, a stronger capacity, a better capacity to implement some of the provisions of the Escazú Agreement. So I definitely think limited resources is one of the challenges that we do have. But I also think that a greater challenge than limited capacity from the point of view of the government is the cultural mindset and the attitude. I do still think that there is this feeling or thinking that the government is doing business and we're doing it for the benefit of the public. Don't worry, you know? You don't need to worry. We know what we're doing. And so oftentimes when there are consultations, public participation processes, I don't think they're done in a meaningful way. I think it's a rubber check, a rubber stamp, you know, just like a checklist process to say they've done it, without any intention of seeing if the outcome of those public consultation processes, the comments from the public, can be really considered, taken on board, and could actually influence a decision. I think it's only what we've seen in our country when there's this great uproar. It makes it on the TV, it's in the newspapers, you know, and the government look bad. That's when you see this sort of response to say, oh, we're gonna do this, we're gonna make sure this happens. So you saw that happen with things like Cockpit Country, you know, Rio Cobre, which for decades Rio Cobre has been polluted, right? The fish kill has been happening for years. And it was only when it became an issue now in the media and press, and you know, it became at a certain level that we started seeing things happening. So that cultural mindset that the government has, I think, needs to shift to appreciate and understand that when we're talking about empowering people and giving people these rights, it's part of democracy. It's part of where we should be moving to. We can't be having conversations about constitutional reform, about moving towards a more progressive state, and then think that things about people participating in ordinary decisions, you know, that impact them daily, is something that shouldn't be done at a higher level. So I think that is one of the challenges I think that we have in Jamaica that needs to be addressed, faced head on.
And feel more valid in
Exactly.
the participation process. What are some of the expected outcomes if Jamaica fully embraces this agreement? And as soon as I asked that, I feel like you would have answered it in a way based on some of the things that we want. But let me know if you have another perspective that you'd want to provide on this response.
Sure. So I've kind of outlined some of the issues related to public participation. But I want to talk about access to information and justice, because I do think that we do have strong laws.
Yes.
You know, our justice system, at least on the face of it, every person has equal access to you know, justice, to be able to challenge a decision. We do have a good justice system, our courts, independent judiciary. You can get remedies from the court. Information, we have an Access to Information Act with an Access to Information Tribunal. So on the face of it, our legal framework looks really good. And so oftentimes I hear from persons, we are already doing this. We already have good standards for information and justice. So Escazú Agreement is not going to really, you know, improve anything. It's not going to really add anything. But one of the things that Escazú Agreement focuses on is implementation. You can have an amazing law, beautiful, giving you everything you want. But if it's not implemented in a proper, effective way, then you're actually just missing the whole point of it. So I'll give you an example. There was a period under the Access to Information Act, not long ago, fairly recent, earlier this year, I think, where the Access to Information Tribunal members, which is a tribunal set up to hear complaints when people are requesting information from the government and they refused information, then they can go to this tribunal and complain. Tribunal members, their term had ended and they had not been reappointed. And so people who had appeals that they had filed with the tribunal for months were waiting. And there was this lack of implementation, and it was something simple as just reappointing people. That's one aspect of it. And just an example, justice. So I've always had the view that if justice is not affordable, then it's not accessible.
Thanks for sharing that insight, Danielle. And so our final question for you is, how can people learn more about the Escazú Agreement, and what role can the public play in pushing for its ratification?
Right. So the Secretariat for the Escazú Agreement is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. So people can go on ECLAC's website. It's cepal.org. You get information about the Escazú Agreement, because I think the first thing that we as people need to do is to be informed about what the Escazú Agreement means. I think most Jamaicans have never heard of it before. It sounds funny, Escazú, what that mean, you know? It's a horrible name, quite frankly, because it doesn't give you any sense or idea about what it means. So I think people, first of all, we need people who are more informed, because at the end of the day, it's a treaty about empowering people. Right? And so if people are going to be empowered, they need to first of all be armed with the information about what it means, and only then can they then advocate for their government to be able to go and ratify it and implement it. So that's the first thing that I would recommend. And the second thing that I would recommend is, in advocating for it, there's so many ways and spaces and forums and platforms that the Escazú Agreement is relevant. Once you understand what it speaks to, you realize how it affects so many facets of our daily life. You can't go out in the road, you can't wake up, you can't go to your job without feeling that there's a sense of some, aspects of environmental information that affects you, some project or activity, something in your environment that you wish you could participate in, some justice issues. There's so many things happening right now in Jamaica. People are having a discussion, for example, about public access to beaches. So there are all these ways in which, and platforms that we can advocate for the government to go and ratify the Escazú Agreement. So I would encourage persons to do that.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And I hear you mention something, and maybe I don't want to give too much away, but it's just all the more reason to encourage our audience to follow this series, as this is actually this podcast series is part of a larger campaign by the Jamaica Environment Trust, JET, around bringing awareness to the Escazú Agreement. So we will be having more discussions in relation to Escazú, what it means for public access to beaches, for the role of young people, for greater community participation, and so on. So I'm really happy that you underscored that. And again, thank you for taking the time to share so much with us. And our big takeaway is that the Escazú Agreement is more than policy. It's about protecting people, and it's about protecting the places where we exist. And one of the biggest things, as you underscored, informed communities are empowered communities. So we appreciate you being here today.
Thank you for having me. All right. Take care.
So to learn more about the Escazú Agreement and also the Defending Our Rights Environmental Justice in Jamaica campaign, visit www.defenders.jamintrust.org, or follow the Jamaica Environment Trust on Instagram and all social media platforms. And don't forget to keep up with the series. follow if you haven't been doing so. Subscribe, like, share, and comment. Thank you so much for tuning in.